Hi, and welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. This week, I interviewed Ginger Wilk. She is a counselor and therapist who has dealt with a myriad of different types of grief and pain. In her work, she has come across many different types of people and grief, such as suppressed grief. We talk today about what is healthy and what is unhealthy when you are grieving. We also discuss what does it really look like to grieve with God? And does the church really support that or help us navigate that? Thank you for joining us in this brand new season 2. I'm looking forward to a full year of great episodes. Welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington, and I'm so glad for you to join us today. Today I have with us Ginger Wilk. So Ginger, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited.
Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Yes, so I have a master's in counseling and a bachelor's degree in psychology. And I think the best way to describe myself is somebody who has been presenting a blend of both psychology and the spiritual experience of understanding God and understanding how the Bible and God's promises and directives interact with psychology. So through the years, I've worked at residential treatment centers for teenagers, people dealing with substance use issues. I've worked in the foster care system, working with teenagers who are going through family difficulties. I have been the director of pastoral care at 2 different churches during the course of time. I've had a pastoral care-based counseling practice that still is in operation today. And presently, I am a senior director over reentry services, and I work for a nonprofit where we focus on helping people who are coming out of prison and getting them back on the right foot. And so I would say overall, my expertise has been about people, understanding people, fascinating details about them, understanding the way that they think and the way they perceive and what is needed in order for them to be every which
And so
way
along
whole.
this journey of your interactions with people, I'm sure you have come across and have seen a variety of grief in their lives. Yes.
Yes. I mean, grief is just such a complicated stage that people go through at different varying times in their lives. I've seen people suffer through a lot of circumstances that they've dealt with. I mean, in the foster care segment, I was dealing with people who were pulled away from their families at a very young age, unable to return back home and having to grieve that, never being able to go back to a family that was their nucleus, their family of origin. I have seen people go through horrific situations where they have encountered the death of one or both parents in situations, domestic violence scenarios where a child has lost a mother to the father being the offender of domestic violence. I've experienced a lot of death and loss as the pastoral care director, because part of my role would be to help families plan funerals, to be a part of actually, doing the funerals, doing the eulogies, being able to bring comfort, and to navigate through having to interact with a variety of people that are all reacting differently to the same event. So I've watched people go through it in a pretty healthy manner, even though painful. I've watched people suffer through, suspended grief that they just can't seem to get past. And my hope is that people will be able to get to the other side of it in a healthy
manner. So I like what you kind of said earlier before we started recording, that grief is not just about losing someone through death. And I think sometimes we think of that, and in our society we don't always like to talk about that. Grief can kind of be a taboo subject. So in what ways do you think we grieve? What are the things might make us or cause us to feel grief?
Well, we grieve when we lose something that was a part of our lives, that was an important factor. it can be as simple as being a part of, a youth group or a community where people go on to college, very simple things like that, where your
Yeah.
group dynamics shift, which
Yeah.
happens through the course of your life. You can grieve through relationships, romantic relationships. A lot of people kind of, poo poo at, the young love, and, how could
Well,
that be so intense to have a 16-year-old that, had a boyfriend or a girlfriend and then they break up. However, that tends to be one of the most
yeah.
intense levels of grief, is the first time that somebody falls in love, and that relationship, which, for the most part almost always will end
Right.
with some sort of a breakup. But the feelings of grief that accompany that, are
Yes.
just so enormous compared to what
Mhm.
people would imagine. Um, we grieve when, any type of change, losing sort of this season that we're in, where we're moving on to another season. We grieve when just something that is familiar to us,
Mm,
shifts. Moving can be
absolutely.
a form of grief. Any type of a transition, being, laid off from a job, or even moving from a job voluntarily. It's a lot easier to, make that change if you're the one that's kind of in control of it. But by the same token, there is
Absolutely.
still a loss that's there. And anytime we have a transition, there's going to be some
Mhm.
cause of stress. But most of all, grief is associated with the death of somebody that we know and love. And what's been hardest for me through the years, in counseling, is that in most cases, when you're counseling somebody, there, you can do
Mm,
something to make it better. If a marriage is failing,
mm,
there's so much hope that you can help to bring that marriage back to a place of health, or, you can help people to navigate through to a hopeful outcome. But when a person
mm.
loses somebody to death, there's nothing that you can do to make that
Right.
particular situation change. It has just, we can comfort people in the afterlife, and knowing that there is heaven and God and so many beautiful things on the other side, but that person is never
Right.
going to be on the earth again. And so that's a really, really hard thing to counsel someone through. You
Mhm.
can't make it better
Right.
by bringing that person back. So the only thing that you can do is really help them to be able to navigate
Mhm.
through those emotions, and to be able to come to a point in their lives where they have joy again, where they have peace, where they can, resume or even create some new goals, where they can have this beautiful end. I remember hearing, from a couple who lost their child years and years ago, that one of the scenarios that helped the father was hearing the fact that grief is a lot like looking out onto, this garden, and there's a stump there. The tree has been cut down to a stump, and that stump is there, and it
Mm,
represents the loss of that child, or the loss of
yeah.
that person in your life. And the whole purpose isn't to remove the stump
Right.
so that you can't see it anymore. You
Yes.
want to remember the person that you lost. You want to remember them, and who they were. But what you can do is you can
Mhm.
plant flowers around it. You can create a garden effect around it. You can have beautiful things in your life that will be side by side
Mm,
with that memory of the person that you love. And so I felt that
yeah.
that was a really good example of kind of, something that helps people grieve effectively. Because again, part of what blocks grief, and we'll talk more about the blocks,
Mm,
but part of it is the guilt of never wanting to forget
right.
that loved one. So that's a part of the reason why people start to feel like they have hope again, and they keep getting drawn back to this magnetic sort of force that brings them to the
Yeah.
memory of that loved one, and it
So
can
a
cause
lot
a
of the
barrier.
time, a lot of what I've been talking about on Grieving with God podcast, we've been exploring the grieving of miscarriages and infant loss, and we've been talking a lot about how in society there a, a lot of society, not all, I think we're getting better, kind of says, well, we don't really want to talk about that. We don't really want to bring that to light. Suffer in silence, and do your own thing. And so, sometimes people say, go ahead and there's no wrong or right way to grieve your own way. But I'm hearing what it sounds like from you, that there are healthy and maybe unhealthy ways that we grieve. And so can you kind of expound on
Yes.
that, on like what might healthy or unhealthy grief look like?
Yes. Well, healthy grief is going to have a variety of emotions that are attached to it. You know, the stages of grief, obviously, there's going to be anger, there's going to be sadness, there's going to be acceptance, there's
Mm,
going to be even joy at times, right? We're going to go through a variety of emotions, and it's not any sort of perfect bell curve of the way that these emotions are expressed. Sometimes people can be angry for days and days and days, weeks and weeks and weeks, and not really, be able to kind of get out of that. And it's okay because that's kind of the stage where they are at that particular time. And then they move to sadness. Sometimes people go through these
yes.
emotions all in the same day, one after another after another. One of the things that I think has been the hardest is that you're talking about miscarriages and losing children and so forth, is that one thing I've noticed is that couples don't usually grieve in
Absolutely.
the same tempo. And that is a very, very tough, concept and understanding, because couples need to be able to lean on one another. They need to be able to process together, but many, many times they simply can't, because, the wife might be in a situation where she's going through tremendous sadness, and maybe the husband
Mm,
is going through denial for a long, long, long period of time.
mm,
And then maybe it switches, or maybe, it's very rare that both of them will be able to kind of like hold, like something like you would think in the movies, holding one another and crying, and both experiencing the same level of sadness
right.
at the same exact
Mhm,
time. It can happen, it's not that it doesn't, but it's definitely not what you would think it would be. um Even in counseling, when you try to get people to talk about it a little bit and you see where they're at completely different stages, and there's a lot of frustration about, I want to be able to talk to you
mm,
about this,
mm.
or don't you care? Robert Frost actually wrote a very, very good, I think it's called
Oh,
Home
wow.
Burial, but it's a very good poem ish short story. And it depicts exactly that. It depicts the fact that the husband and
That's
the
right.
wife are not on the same page with their grief. And so I think that's what makes it really, really difficult. But in looking at a healthy way of grieving, it's
Mm,
going to have movement to it. I think that what is going to depict an unhealthy level of grief is when it really
yeah.
just stops and it gets very
Mhm,
stagnant and stuck. And you'll notice that when you talk to people that are stuck, they simply cannot move on to sort of that next phase of their lives. I remember going over to friends of ours, and they had lost a grandmother very, very close to her. And the entire living
mm,
room was a shrine to this particular grandmother, but not just for the first few months. I mean, it was years and years and years later, and her name was constantly coming up over and over and over again. And you could see that the family couldn't even have, they couldn't even sit in the living room. There was
mm.
no furniture in there. There was
Yep.
no living in the living room. And so that's a clear sign of where there's a barrier. The other thing is when people are caught up in
Mm,
the idolatry of the person that passes away. And of course, idolatry is a strong word, and we're not really living in the age where you have people
mhm.
physically worshiping, like we would think of worshiping or in the Bible, or idolatry in the Bible, but where that person is put on a pedestal, right? And that's where we get into a lot of difficulties, because that person, whoever they
Mhm.
were imperfect, right? And they were not at this place of perfection. They never were. They never would be. They had I know it's tougher with babies, but when you're talking about adults or whatever, they had days when they ticked you off. They had days when you loved
Yeah.
talking with them. They had habits that you didn't like. And what happens is, a lot of times when people get stuck in their grief, they just put that person on a pedestal, and now all of a sudden everything about them is
Mhm,
about how wonderful they were, how amazing that they
mhm,
were. And they're not able to look at the
mhm.
flaws. And just because somebody is no longer on this earth doesn't mean that all of those flaws went away. And so when people are able to focus on the flaws as well
Yeah.
as the positive things, they have a much higher level of being able to get through the grief.
Mm,
appropriately. But you'll have somebody that just, oh, she was a saint, or he was the best person in the world, he was the best father in the world, he was this. And that's just simply not true. We know, as great as people are, like, if you really sit down and have a real conversation, and this is about any of us, like, you know let's keep it in balance. This is, they
Mm-hmm.
yell too much, or they they spend too much money or whatever. And I think when you look at that person realistically, in a human manner, then that's when you'll be able to really, your
Yes.
humanity and their humanity can kind of
Beautiful.
resolve.
So I'm curious, what
So
if um, there is the opposite of that? I mean, would that be considered healthy or unhealthy, where there's no mention of the deceased loved one, or no mention of the grief that they're going through, whether it be a loss of a job or a move or something, where there is a complete barrier, you've said before, but like a shut off, and like how would you
right.
plan? Is that on the healthier side, or is it in the same vein as making an idol out of the grief?
I think that that would be considered a form of denial that
Mm.
never gets resolved. So someone gets stuck in that phase of denial. And I think that's unhealthy too. Like, anytime we're stuck, anytime that there isn't movement in our lives, because
Yes.
God is a God of
Oh,
movement, right? Fire by night, cloud by day. So we always want to just camp out somewhere, right? Or human nature causes us to want to camp out, like the whole wanting to build a tabernacle, right? Like always wanting to kind of stay put. And God is always
mm,
wanting to bring movement. He wants us to come to an understanding of where he is now, what season that we're in. And so if somebody is in complete and total, denial, where they're
mm,
stuck, then something's wrong. Like, for instance, I remember my very, very first counseling client that I had was a kind of like a 19-year-old male, and his family moved because of, I don't even know what it was, if it was that the house went into foreclosure or whatever, but they ended up moving, and his room sat with the boxes like literally sitting there unpacked. He didn't put a single thing up
yeah.
on his wall, right? And so part of my goal was obviously unpacking why he was so upset about the move and trying to get him to establish
Mm,
some goals for himself. But a real goal was getting him to actually pull out something, one poster, one picture, something, and put it up on the wall, because that represented that I am now taking
mm,
control of this space, and I am going to, adorn this area where I'm living right now, and I'm going to, drop anchor right now in the season that I'm in, rather than mourning
yeah.
for the house down the street that
Mm-hmm.
I'm not in anymore. So I think that I know that there's usually a reason why people stay in a state of denial. Many, many times it could be, the trauma of it
Mm-hmm.
all. It depends on
Right.
what the loss was, if it's the loss of a job, many men have suffered through having been, fired or laid off from a job, because, of course, for men, what they do for a living tends to be like a big part of their identity, whereas with women, a lot of times we're
Yeah.
identified by a lot of things: our children, and
Home.
our hobbies, and our ministry and
Yeah.
our job. But with men, it tends to be more of a factor that identifies them as who they are. And so a lot of times what will happen is, maybe you notice that they're not looking for
Mm,
another job, like it almost looks like they have a very
yeah.
long vacation, right? Because the reality of looking for a job means that they have to
Yeah.
acknowledge that they lost one. And so sometimes it really takes an outside person to be able to kind of bring them into a place where they can really begin to, embrace a new season. And but with death, it's case by case as to why people get stuck in their grief. I mean, sometimes
Mhm.
it's the culture that they're, raised up in. Whether some cultures embrace death, with a 100%
Yeah.
kind of approach, where it's, a whole like week, 2 week, month long thing. People come down from all sorts of parts of the world. There's
Yeah.
multiple celebrations of the life of the person.
Yeah.
It's very visual. It's very vocal. There's,
Mhm.
memories that are shared throughout the course of time. They keep it alive, but in a healthy way. Other
Yes.
cultures, it's very hush hush, where it's, you barely know. There's private funerals. It's
Mhm.
over in 3 days. People kind of expect that there shouldn't be any sort of interaction
Right.
that's needed anymore, because you sort of did what you needed to do. You sent the card, you sent the flowers, and it's over with. And so death through the years, and through the different cultures and different parts of the world, has been acknowledged in a very
Mhm.
different manner. And I think that the more that it's sort of overt,
I agree.
the healthier that it can be.
Mhm.
Much like in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
Sackcloth and ashes, and, long, long, long celebrations of
Mhm.
life and mourning. That was very visual. People saw it. There was no question
Yes.
whether you were mourning.
So, in a moment, I want to talk to you about suspended grief and the blocks that we might have in our grief. But do you believe that grief is linear, meaning that we go through all those stages of grief and then we wrap it up and we put it away and we move on with our lives? Or is it something that, to varying degrees of sadness, that we just kind of live with grief after we have experienced something traumatic or sad?
I think that we live with grief to a degree, but I think that the intensity of it should lessen. So it definitely shouldn't be something that is the same level of kind of impact as in the beginning, that where there's more and more days in between. There's less and less length of that emotional reaction. It's kind of more sporadic. Grief is something that you
Mm,
don't know when it's going to hit you. It can hit you at varying times. A lot of times it's brought through
mm,
our five senses, which also too with trauma is brought through the five senses. Smell being the biggest kind of recall sense, that gives us that recall. So for instance, my mother passed away. Gosh, now it's almost 10 years ago, but to this day, I can be walking in the store, or even my daughter has it. A rose scented, like, body spray or facial wash, whenever I smell that, if somebody has that on, immediately I think about my
oh,
mother. I
yeah.
go right back to my mother when I smell that. And my daughter has something that has that scent to it. And I could be not having thought about my mother for days and days and days. And all of a sudden, bam, I smell that and it's there. And that's why a lot of people who have lost children, I remember that our former pastors lost a
Mm,
child when he was 7 years old, and it was
mhm,
really difficult on the congregation. And I remember that the wife, she held on to the laundry basket filled with his
mm,
dirty laundry for years and years and years. It was the only thing she wanted out of her house when she was moving. Because if she opened it up and for a long period of time, she
mm,
could smell him. She could just
mm,
smell, a little bit of the scent of her 7 year old boy. And it was such an important thing for her, years on end, to be able to still have that scent. So our five senses will bring us back. We can see something. Again, back to my mother. I mean, I would go into the grocery store and see, she used to get this Entenmann's, like,
yeah.
kind of like a coffee cake. And that's what we would have all the time whenever we were at her house. She always had one of those. And so if I walk by the aisle to this day and I see that coffee cake, it brings me right back. So I truly do believe that even when we've completely gotten ourselves to a place where we've moved on and we're
Mm,
embracing hope and change and newness, the we can be brought right back to that place again. And it should bring us a little bit of sadness, but sometimes
yeah.
joy in remembering that person. It's not something that should be
Yes. Right.
debilitating to us. um, the other thing is that change is something, I'm sorry, not change, but grief is something that, just like when people are
Mm,
getting sober, right? They're an alcoholic or a drug addict and they embrace sobriety. That first year is very, very critical because that year means that they're going to have to navigate through 12 months and several seasons without alcohol. They're going to have a sober existence. And so when we go through grief, it's navigating through that first year, particularly where you can have really, really good days. But then all of a sudden, now I've got to get through Christmas, in not having that person there. We thought that that
Yeah.
stocking would
Right.
be hung for that person, or that present would be given to them, or we would have this type of celebration, the summertime and a vacation and whatever those memories are, and how that person would have fit into those celebrations and isn't part of those celebrations, is a very
Excuse me.
rough thing. So you could have 3 months of really
Right.
difficult grieving, that's super intense, and then start to feel much, much better and have, your emotions are more under control, and then get
Yeah.
set off
Right.
by those things. So I do think all of those levels kind of can affect grief. The other thing is, if you lost a child, having another
Oh
child
yeah.
can bring that on again. If I've was talking to a colleague the other day, and he lost his wife about 5 years ago, and he's been dating somebody, and he just can't seem to bring
Yeah.
himself to propose to this new person, and he really likes her, loves her a lot, and everything, but at the end of the day, he's
Yeah.
feeling tremendous guilt about remarrying. And, it's an indicator that he's not quite
Right.
there yet. He's getting there, but he's not quite
So
there
I
yet.
wanted to talk
So,
about, you said suspended grief. And I'm wondering if that's similar to like suppressed grief, but what do you mean when you said suspended grief?
well, I think that that's where you see the barriers that come in. So, for instance, to give a good example of that, I would do these encounters with a team of people, and we would talk about a lot of different things.
Mm,
And one was forgiveness. Forgiveness was a whole session. And we would prompt the people after the session to come up and kind of talk through somebody that they
mm,
might need to forgive, whether it's their dad from when they were a little girl or whatever. And I remember that there was one woman who came up to me, and I asked her, who is it that you think you need to forgive? And she mentioned people, a boss, this one or that one.
mm,
And I could just tell that there was something else that was there. And I said, "Are you sure there's not someone else, that you're really thinking about, or you're reluctant to kind of acknowledge that you have some bitterness towards?" And we kind of, like, I asked her about different family members, and then we got to the point of discussing her husband, and her husband had just passed away a couple of years ago. And she just adored him. They're both elderly. She adored him tremendously. They had a great relationship. But when he died, he left her with a very disabled granddaughter
mm,
that they had custody of. And this granddaughter took a tremendous amount of time and energy to keep her in a place where she was healthy. And he also left her with a
yeah,
tremendous amount of debt. And again, he didn't have any control over, he passed away pretty quickly. I don't think that he would have had the
mm,
time to do anything in that period of time. But by the same token, she was still extremely
yeah.
bitter and upset. And she was feeling so much guilt
Mm.
about being angry
Oh
at
yeah.
somebody who was deceased. And this is a thing that many, many people struggle with, and they just don't talk about it. That it is okay to be angry at a
Yeah.
person that has passed away. It is, and not only is it okay, but it's appropriate, because if that's what the emotion is, then that's what you have to acknowledge. Because if you're just looking at the sadness of, this person in my life that, that died and that they're no longer here, and you have those issues, you're not going to
Mm,
be able to have that
yeah.
sadness. You're
Yeah.
going to get stuck, that it's going to be
Yeah.
suspended. And so we basically just talked it through, and I gave her permission to be able to acknowledge the fact that she had anger and bitterness. And so we just sort of, I led her through an exercise where I
Mm,
stood in proxy. So I pretended that I was her husband, and she spoke to me about
Mm.
why she was angry and why she was sad. And I'll tell you that it was like a
Oh.
river of relief and freedom that just came
Mhm.
out from her, when she could finally just forgive this man and acknowledge that
Yeah.
she was incredibly angry at him,
Yeah.
even though she
Yeah.
missed him
I know when my
tremendously.
when my mother
So,
passed, it's been about 6 years since my mother passed, coming up this December, and there was a season, and it wasn't right away. It was, I'd say, at least a year, maybe longer, where anger came up, and I was suddenly like overwhelmed with these feelings of anger towards my mother for certain things that happened on her deathbed, certain things that happened as a child. And I remember going, like, feeling really confused and guilty, and reaching out to my brothers and saying, "Are you mad? Like, because I'm mad." And they're like, "We're not mad. We're fine." And I'm like, "I'm so strange then. I don't know why I'm feeling this." But I think that what you said, giving yourself the permission to feel this, to work through it, to process it, and
yes.
then to be able to move on from that point. But like you're saying, if you're not grieving that, if I didn't allow myself to think about or talk about, what was going on with how I was feeling, yeah, I think I'd be stuck. And so is that kind of what you meant earlier when you're talking about the blocks of grief? Blocks.
Yes, yes. So of bitterness or unforgiveness is a huge block. Not really being honest about the reality of the
Mm,
relationship that you had with that person can be a big block, because again, the expectation is, oh, like in your
mm,
case, and I don't know anything about like that relationship, but oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Dawn, about your
mm,
mom. You must be devastated, right? And maybe that wasn't the feeling at all about devastation. Sadness, yes. Devastation is a
yeah.
huge
Oh,
like word. It's not, it doesn't
mhm,
define everybody's experience. And so for somebody to be feeling something different than what they're expected to feel, then that
mhm,
guilt that comes in. So it can be bitterness and it can be guilt that I'm
mhm,
supposed to be feeling this way, and I'm not. And what do I do with that?
mhm,
How do I resolve that? And the real truth is to just acknowledge what the true feelings are. I mean, sometimes people's grief is not that they lost that person, but the fact that they never had an opportunity to make that
mm,
relationship
mhm,
better. Like all they really wanted to do was to kind of get
mm.
some resolution to a
Yeah,
bad
yeah.
relationship, right? And then to feel robbed that that person died and they never got an opportunity to at least just have that last sort of conversation, because they always felt as though
Mhm,
they had time to. But it's not that their lives were defined
mhm.
by that person, right? I mean, one of the biggest ways that people really understand grief early on with children is with pets. They say that that's one of the most intense feelings of grief. If you want to try to explain to a child what it feels like to
Mm,
lose somebody that's important, it's not so much talking to them about their
mhm.
grandmother. It's talking to them about
Right.
their dog that they
Yeah, that
lost or their
makes sense.
cat that they
Yeah.
lost. Why? Because what makes those feelings intense is when someone or an animal, whatever, is there every single day of your lives. They're part of your routine, they're part of your habits, right? And not everyone that we lose
Mhm,
falls into that category. So that's why, obviously losing somebody in your own household is going to be intense. Losing a pet is going to be intense. Breaking up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or
mhm,
having a divorce, right? All of those things are going to be a much like wider sphere of emotions than somebody that just died that we knew or that was
mhm.
related to us but we haven't seen for, I mean, I just lost an uncle and I felt so sad for the family, and I'm sad that he's not here anymore, but I hadn't
Right.
seen him for
So
like
it's
4
different. Yeah.
years, right? So he's my uncle and I'm concerned about him, but not everybody is going to have that same level of kind of reaction. And I think that the societal pressures definitely can cause
Mm,
that guilt
yeah.
factor
Yeah.
to be in
Yeah.
there.
Um, I had a question, and because I'm going to be recording a podcast soon about trauma and grieving, and through processing trauma. And so there's this thing where as we are going through our lives, we're starting to start, hey, that was traumatizing for me, or I didn't realize I had this trauma, or I had this wound, like church wounds, we talk a lot about, and we talk about relationship wounds. And that as we are processing these wounds or these traumas, all of a sudden there's this grief that is surfacing. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that,
Yes.
or what that could be, or how do you navigate through that? Like, because it's not necessarily, oh, I lost something, I lost a person, which is concrete. You can like refer back to, I lost my pet, I lost my mom. Like that's where this grief is coming from. But trauma seems to have a different kind of grief.
It does. And I with trauma, I mean, it
Mm,
is a loss of something. Maybe it's
mm,
a loss of innocence if there's been, abuse, loss of
yeah.
years of someone's life, a loss of even just the innocence of our
Mm,
mindset of, you know, when you never have, like, for instance, if you've never been robbed, right? You've
mhm.
never had a purse snatched. You've never had somebody come and attack you from behind. You've never had somebody go into your house and rob you. And
Right.
hopefully that describes a lot of us, right? But if somebody has
Hmm.
had that happen to them, then, they're going to be thinking very differently
Hmm.
when they walk down the street, or they're going to be thinking differently when they hear a noise
Hmm.
in their house at night. And that's because of the trauma. That's sort of the
Hmm.
PTSD type reaction that we have when we've been through trauma. A small noise, something that we see, or, a person that we see across the way, like we're going to have
Yeah.
suspicions that we never had before. And so that's one of the hardest parts about trauma. Also, too, is our
Hmm.
perception, because perception is so different from person to person. And it's almost more powerful than
Mm-hmm.
truth. It isn't, but working with somebody that's gone through trauma or gone through anything in counseling, yeah, there's the truth about what's occurred, but how are you
Yeah.
seeing it? How do you see yourself in
Yeah.
reference to that trauma? Do you have some blame, of yourself and your situations? Do you see it as being as big of a deal as
Hmm.
your mother might, or your husband might, or whoever? Are you minimizing it? Are you denying it? Are you over exaggerating it? Are you hyper, sensitive? I think it's just the aftermath of our trauma. It's kind of like if you have a physical trauma, someone gets into like a car accident or whatever, and you can go in to the hospital and they check out, are you bleeding? Are you scratched? Are you whatever? But you can be released without anything that's visible, but then later on there could be internal bleeding or things that occur. And when someone's gone through a trauma, they can act as if there really isn't much that's gone on, and people
Yep.
are resilient. That's one thing I've learned over the years, is that I cannot believe how resilient
Yeah.
God made people. What they can recover from, what we can recover from, how we can still find hope in situations when we've been through difficult times is
Yeah.
is just remarkable. But also, too, some things don't show up until later on, and also trauma tends to show up through the course of time. Different events in our lives will bring it about. So, like, for instance, one of the things I've noticed is that someone can go through, perhaps, maybe they went through a situation with mom and dad were fighting all the time, or there was some really dysfunctional stuff going on with their parents, and they can navigate through that, go to college, kind of live into their adult lives, and look like everything is fine. But then when they get into a committed relationship, right, now all of a sudden a simple argument in their minds can sound 10 times the volume that what it really was, or you're emotionally can just feel like your heart is just
Hmm.
breaking in a million pieces because there's a simple argument that happens. That's a
Yeah.
result of trauma. Or, in my case, I was bullied when I was a child a little bit at school. And you can go through your entire life and get through it, but when I had my girls, and the first time that, my daughter Hannah came home from school and said, oh, this person, this little girl said I couldn't play with her because my
Oh.
hair wasn't blonde.
Oh.
And that's a true story. I thought that I was gonna die. I
Mm.
was so upset. It was for Hannah, not for me, but it became something that was about me as well as about my daughter Hannah, because it brought me back to the trauma
Yeah.
of when I was a little girl. And so that's how trauma kind of rears its head, right? Is through situations that present themselves to us. We don't always navigate through them like in a
Yeah. No, that
logical
makes sense.
manner.
So the podcast is called Grieving with God. So I'm going to ask this question. As we grieve, and we all have different degrees of grieving, we have different levels, we all feel things differently, we experience them differently, we might grieve at different times. In what ways, I'm going to ask, what ways can we draw closer to God during our grief? And I said earlier, I don't like to use the word, how can we invite God into our grief? Because that makes a picture that God's just kind of needs our permission to come and grieve with us. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I
Mm.
think it is us needing to turn around and see that he's there, and is grieving with us. And
Yeah.
so I always say that when we were grieving Ezekiel, our counselor, said to us, one of the things she saw that we did that she applauded was that we leaned in to the grief and that we leaned into
Mm.
God. We had questions, we had anger, we had confusion. Um, but instead of pulling away and saying, I don't want to be with God anymore, we leaned in and said, okay, how can we grieve this with him? And so I'm just curious, like what do you see as like a way that we can draw closer to God in our grief and grieve with him, and how do you think he grieves with us?
Yeah, he definitely does. I'll tell you, God is really literally the only one who can minister to
Mm,
people truly in their grief, in the most effective manner, because people tend to, and I know I'm sure you've experienced this, people tend to say a lot of stupid things when we're going through grief. Things that aren't necessarily helpful to us, aren't necessarily true. So the prophetic nature of hearing directly from God, super specific to where we're
mm,
at, is so essential. The other thing that's really important is I love how God shows us through the Bible how emotions
yes.
are okay
Yeah.
to be felt and experienced. And in my time in working with a lot of Christians over the years, one of the biggest things that I've had to work on is getting people to understand that sometimes churches and church communities socialize people
I
to
agree.
suppress
Yes.
their emotions. That, for women, for instance, it's
Hmm.
not okay to be angry. Women are socialized, Christian women are socialized to just
Yeah.
omit that emotion completely. Men are socialized, and Christian men are socialized to
Right.
not experience sadness, to not experience that type of an emotion. And where that comes from, I don't know, but it's
Yep.
definitely part of the culture of a lot of the evangelical churches in particular. And so what happens is a lot of Christians, they go through situations, and then they come to a point where they're about to express an emotion around grief, and they block it themselves because they think that they're supposed to pull a
Mm,
scripture out of their pocket and just apply it to that situation, and then it's going to be fine. But yet you have God who mentions
mm,
repeatedly how he's angry through the word of God. You have Jesus who
mm,
wept over Lazarus. Jesus wept over Jerusalem, right? Like you have Jesus was filled with joy. Like we have examples of God the Father and Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit as well, being able to express how important emotions are. So when you press into God, a broken and contrite
mhm,
spirit he will not despise. When you press into God, that's actually going to be the place where you're going to have the most appropriate emotion. And I always tell people, listen, don't hold back. Get right in God's face and just tell him exactly what you're thinking and what you're feeling, and don't hold back, because
right.
he already knows it
Right.
anyway. And when people get to that point where they know that they can go right into God's face, and they can even be ticked off at him, they can be,
Yep.
point fingers at him, they can
Yeah.
be angry, they can be sad, they can be disappointed. They can feel hopeless.
Mm.
That's how you grieve with God, is by being
Oh, I
real
love
and
that.
transparent. And unfortunately, a lot of times
Well,
that's not the church talk that you get, but that's the real true experience of how people are
oh,
able
I
to
love
navigate
that, and
through
that's
it.
everything. I mean, I totally agree with that. When, in the beginning of our grieving process, all I found from the Christian church, and it has changed since, the past 7 years, there's been more literature that's come out, but all I found from the Christian circles, evangelical circles and books, was all these trite sayings of like, just trust
Yes.
God, and he's there for you, and he's got a plan, and this is for a reason. None of which solved or helped the grieving process at all. Some of it made it worse because I'm sitting here with all of this
Yes.
anger and all of these questions. And I just wanted to run to my father and feel like he welcomed me. And that was not a prevailing
Yeah.
message of the church at the time. And I feel like it's starting to
Yes.
change. And that's kind of what I really promote through this podcast, is that he is the father who wants to welcome you open arms, anger and all, and being transparent with him
Yeah.
is the key. And I love that. I love that you said that. That's very beautiful.
Why should we try to be anything or feel anything
Mhm.
than who we are and what our reality is? And that we'll know the truth, and the truth will set us free, right? And the truth is sometimes how we're questioning our theology, and how we, are not we don't feel like being married at the time, and
Right.
whatever we're feeling at that particular moment. I mean, God is going to gently guide us back to a place where we can come to our senses again. But God gives us the ability to be able to just be and feel whatever it is,
Yep.
without judgment. And so that's the reality of how we can really have health,
Yeah.
going forward. So,
Well, everything you
yeah.
shared, I was just packed full. I'm sure we could have multiple episodes on grief and all things we can do to unpack it. So I'm just so thankful for you coming on to the show today and sharing your expertise and your knowledge, and really just helping us to understand the different levels of grief, especially suppressed grief, blocks of grief, what's healthy, what's not healthy. I want you to share a little bit about your podcast and where we can find it, what it's called, and what do you talk about on your podcast?
Sure. So the name of the podcast is That Which Matters. So if you search That Which Matters Ginger Wilk, you will find it on Apple Music or on Spotify. And I am just recording now the beginning of my third
Wonderful.
season. So there are 2 seasons already that have been recorded. And it's a variety of topics, some of which we touched on a little bit today, but talking about
Mm.
everything from shame to hope to dreams, to unhealthy
Mhm.
church communities, abuse of
Wow.
authority, just basically even birthdays, how people have difficulties sometimes with celebrations of their own lives, and basically things that come up in
Mhm.
counseling all the time, that depict human experiences and just wisdom to go along with each one of those things. So definitely, if you like it, give me a 5 star, and share it with others, because my hope and dream is that it'll go to
Well,
a
I will
multitude
try
of
to find
people.
your link and post it in the show notes. And so it should be easy for people to find if they just go and click on that from the show notes
Yes.
here, and they can find your show, That Which Matters. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for joining us this week on the Grieving with God episode. I hope to see you soon, especially as I begin to launch my Ezekiel podcast. So I will be spending about 10 minutes at a time, maybe once or twice a month, discussing what actually started this podcast, what brought me down this path talking about grief. So I will be sharing short episodes talking about our time with Ezekiel. Also, keep a lookout for my new book that should be released sometime beginning of this year, called Ezekiel's Star. See you next week.